U.S. support for the Colombian military predates Plan Colombia by many years. The first U.S. military advisors arrived in Colombia in 1940. During the Cold War, the United States rewarded Colombia for sending Colombian troops into the Korean War, and hemispheric defense was morphed into internal security during the time of La Violencia in the 1950s, in the mid-1950s, when 200,000 Colombians were killed in civil violence within Colombia. So Colombia, at that time, in the 1950s, received more military assistance from the U.S. than any other country in the hemisphere. In 1960, there was a CIA survey of Colombia's military needs, and it was followed 2 years later by a trip from General William Yarborough, who recommended that the Colombian military form units to, quote, execute paramilitary sabotage and/or terrorist activities against known communist proponents. In the 1990s, as the drug war became the umbrella for U.S. military intervention in the region, Colombia was already the largest recipient of military aid in the Americas, about $300 million a year before Plan Colombia started. One other measure of the entrenched nature of this relationship is I have figured out who are the top 34 Colombian Army commanders of the Army, of divisions, and of brigades. Of those 34 top commanders, 29 were trained at the School of the Americas. All of them were trained at the School of the Americas before Plan Colombia started. As others have said, this was sold to the United States as a drug war, but after September 11th, Plan Colombia became openly counterinsurgent. And it's very interesting because even though 3/4 of the assistance is for counter-drug objectives, that's what it's designed to do. Politically, it's sold here as a counter-terrorist plan. That President Uribe has made the country safer. I don't know if any of you have ever lived in a neighborhood where the mafia is present. They're often very safe neighborhoods because the mafia has eliminated all of their opposition. And this is essentially what has happened in Colombian cities, is that the paramilitaries, supported by the Colombian state, moved in and was able to eliminate any armed opposition, any kind of dispute for territory in the cities primarily. Now, Plan Colombia is also was sold and continues to be sold to Democrats who might be potentially, maybe, likely allies on the basis of protection for human rights. And there are three basic provisions that have been sold to the Democrats as a way that this can be done. One is that the assistance would be certified based on the Colombian military's respect for human rights. And so about 1/4 of the $500, $600 million every year is based on a certification by the State Department. The second is that the Army, the military, would receive human rights training from the United States. And the third is that each of the units, Army units, military units that receive this assistance would be vetted for any gross violations of human rights. And those units that have a record of committing gross human rights violations would not receive assistance. At the beginning of Plan Colombia, there were no such units. They had to create them. So the reason is that impunity is systemic. And this is why these promises of human rights protection are fallacious. Because for all the crimes that have been committed by the Colombian Army, there's about a 95% impunity rate. You could increase that maybe. You could maybe double the rate of prosecution and still have a 90% impunity rate. And you would still have the same problems in the country. Since the partial demobilization of the paramilitaries in 2006, the Army has become the principal agent of civilian killings, about more than 400 civilians killed in 2007. And one of the main ways in which this has occurred is that the Army is under pressure to create body counts. And so there's something that has been called false positives. That is, that the army will kidnap or hire someone to kidnap a civilian. The army then executes the person, and then claims them as a guerrilla killed in combat, thus increasing the claim of the number of guerrillas killed in combat and the military victory in the war, and then the troops and their unit can get more leave, get vacation, or actually get additional cash. So many people attribute this phenomenon of extrajudicial killings by the army to this pressure for body counts. But I think at least as important is the level of impunity, which has been reinforced by U.S. policy, and I'll come back to that in a minute, and also by the conflation of combatants with civilians. The identification of inconvenient civilians with guerrillas has been raised to a fetish by President Uribe. In fact, just last week, he came out and said, basically, anytime we have a military victory, then the people who favor human rights in the United States and in Europe and in Colombia come out and say that this was a killing by the army, that this was a killing of civilians. So he constantly says that these people who are criticizing the government for human rights are identified with the FARC guerrillas, or are former FARC guerrillas, or are doing the work of the guerrillas, thus laying the groundwork for this identification and confusion of combatants and civilians. So we tried to study the army units that were responsible for extrajudicial killings, and also which units are receiving, are approved to receive U.S. military aid. That aid is mostly helicopters, training, and intelligence. And we found that close to half of the reported civilian killings in 2007 were committed by units that had received U.S. aid in 2006 or 2007. The United States was doing something additional, which was that it was pulling individuals from units that had not been vetted for their human rights record and sending them to training primarily in the United States. And if you count those units, 95% of the units that are committing killings of civilians had received some kind of U.S. assistance.